Now, I'd like to welcome to the show Jeffrey Westling, Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum, where his research focuses on telecommunications, online content policy, and antitrust. Welcome to Free the Economy, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
So, today we're looking at the Federal Communications Commission and their role, especially in licensing broadcasters, so radio and TV stations. So, new FCC Chairman Brendan Carr has been out there, and he's gotten a fair amount of criticism recently, both over the last few months, but then just this week in response to an interview he did with the news site Semaphore about wanting his agency to allegedly go after news outlets and talked about revoking their broadcast licenses for being politically on the left or being opposed to President Trump's agenda. So that's very much in the news. Jeff, do you think FCC Chairman Carr's his recent comments about broadcast licenses and media bias are those reasonable or are they problematic and something we should worry about?
Well, I think there's two separate components of that question. And one is it reasonable? And number two, is it something he could theoretically do? And I'm going to start with the latter question just because it's important to get kind of the baseline down. And just under current law, the FCC does have a lot of authority over how broadcasters operate. I don't want to say a lot of authority, but a lot more than you would expect. And that's because broadcasters have to operate over the airwaves. And to operate a radio in the United States, you need to get a license from the FCC. And the Communications Act has what is known as the public interest standard. Because you can't have, you know, 3,000 different local broadcasters, because if you have too many, they'll interfere with each other and the signal won't come through. You won't be able to tune into anything. The FCC has to some degree, pick a winner and pick a loser. It's just the nature of the engineering there. So the courts have said, look, there's this scarcity of the medium, only so many licenses in the market. The FCC, go ahead, do some regulation on the content that the broadcasters are giving to the public. So that way it's always in the public interest. And normally that has come down to things like kids TV rules or something where you would have to have a certain amount of your programming dedicated to children's television, or you've got maybe a equal time rule for politicians coming on your show. If you give the politician of one party time for a commercial, you've got to give the other time for the commercial. So in that sense, the FCC can kind of look at some of these complaints against the broadcasters, and there is a thing called the news distortion rule, which a lot of these complaints are getting filed under, which basically says broadcasters can't intentionally distort the news, and so that's been on the books for a long time. The Supreme Court has upheld it. I believe the Supreme Court, it might be the DC Circuit, and basically said, yeah, this is something that the FCC is allowed to look at. The second part of your question, though, is, or really the first part of your question, but I'm making it the second part of your question, is this reasonable? And that's where I tend to very much disagree with the chairman. You can keep these open for comment like he's done, but he's come out publicly stating like there is bias, there is anti-conservative coverage of the news, and it's up to him to go after a lot of these what he perceives as biased news reports. And it's not just broadcasting, it's also some of the big tech stuff he's been doing. But the broadcasters in particular are one that he's really going after. And I think the intention is to try to affect how they are covering public events, how they are covering this administration. And that inherently is at odds with the FCC's role. And despite what I've said already in this interview, the First Amendment justifications are not that strong. Like you can't go out of your way and say you have to air X, Y, or Z. You have to do the news in different ways. The courts have been pretty clear on that. This like news distortion rule is very specific. You need to have like evidence that there's been management decisions where they intentionally are airing a false narrative with the intent to deceive, and you need to have a lot of evidence. It's a very high standard. It's not like a rational basis or something. There needs to be a lot of evidence, and I think the chairman knows that they likely didn't violate the news distortion rule. They probably will be able to transfer these licenses and get them renewed. But you don't necessarily need to revoke the license to still have an impact. And that's something we've been complaining about from the Biden administration for a long time. And now it seems like we're just kind of flipping it on its head and say, well, now that Republicans are in power, let's go after some of what we perceive as the liberal media. And that's very problematic. And it's I don't want to say he's gone too far yet, because again, all he's done so far is open the complaints up for public comment, which is something he's legally required to do if there's enough evidence there. So it's not like he's gone too far yet, but the public statements paired with that action is really where you get to the job owning question.
Well, yeah, and so like you said, the Biden administration has its own concerns about this, or we have our own concerns about what the Biden administration did about going after public information they didn't like. And this sort of rolls into some of the things Carr said about, his comments, like you said, weren't just about broadcast, which is really what the FCC's job is. They were
Mhm.
about like social media platforms and things like that. And a lot of the other, he's sort of been echoing a lot of the same complaints that conservatives had about social media basically before Elon Musk bought Twitter, right? When it was
Yeah.
very common in the conservative political world for people to complain that social media platforms were censoring conservative viewpoints. So we saw that, in like the Twitter files after, the post Elon era. We had congressional hearings where there were all sorts of documents about Twitter sort of being nudged by the White House to shadow ban or deprioritize or otherwise censor viewpoints they didn't like, especially about having to do with COVID and public health information. And then Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook slash Meta, has said made public statements himself saying that Facebook sort of collaborated with the White House and public health officials to suppress information in ways that he regrets and would not do in the future. And then, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Nina Jankowicz, who is appointed the head of what at the time was called the Disinformation Governance Board. I think it should have been an anti-disinformation governance board, probably.
You would think they'd get the title a little bit more friendly than that, but
So all of that stuff happened under Biden, and so compared to what is potentially a too aggressive FCC, looking back at what happened in those 4 years, on a scale of one to Hitler, how bad was the Biden team when it came to free speech?
I mean, it was pretty bad. We've seen a lot of the reports that you've described come out, and I think that I don't want to say they were close to Hitler because that's really bad. Um, but they definitely were out there trying to influence how these companies were moderating content, and it was the usual playbook is essentially we have this legal protection called Section 230. It allows, social media companies to not be sued for what people post, and it basically gives them the freedom to moderate content. It's a really vital protection for companies to make sure they don't get sued out of existence. And because it's so vital, you've got this threat on the back end saying if you don't start acting right, if you don't police content, if you let all these harmful things spread, we might revisit that. And it's this threat that's always looming over the heads of these companies. And I'm probably somebody who's not as far on some of these discussions as the libertarian crowd, where it's like the government should never talk to a social media company. I actually don't think that's true. I do actually think there's a role to be played where social media companies can get information from some of these government agencies and from these officials. The important thing though is it needs to be, very transparent and very much like just an information gathering experiment, and not that kind of coercion. But I think one of the problems we're running into, though, is because the Biden administration was very coercive on a lot of these companies, and we're seeing a lot of these reports coming out now. It's almost given some of the folks on the right a justification. Was like, well, look how bad the last administration was. They've set the precedent. We can now do the same thing. And as a policy person and not a politics person, that terrifies me. It's really not a good thing to be hearing that, like, well, just because somebody else did a bad thing, now we can do the bad thing.
Yeah, and speaking of the importance of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, I should let everyone know that CEI has just released a short series podcast called Otherwise Objectionable, all about the history of Section 230, hosted by Tech Dirt's Mike Mesnick. So find that also. And when you're done listening to this episode, go find Otherwise Objectionable about the history of Section 230. Yeah, so the idea that the other team did a bad thing, so now we're gonna double down on doing that same bad thing is not a great policy rationale. Um, but so one response is that should government agencies and companies be talking to each other at all? Um, on the one hand, I agree with you that they should at least be able to talk to each other, but also concerned because the when you're a government regulator, when you say something, it's not just an opinion,
Yeah.
right? Especially if you're saying it directly to a company that you have statutory authority to regulate.
Hmm.
So this sort of like hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Oh well, it would be terrible if something bad happened to your company. Maybe you should just do the thing we want you to do. It's very easy for what seems on the surface to be a casual conversation to turn into what is effectively a shakedown.
Yeah.
So I think it's something that you need like some guardrails and potentially more transparency about. Because of course that was sort of the problem is that none of these communications were public. So no one who was a user on any of these platforms could say, "Oh, well, look, you're just responding to that thing that the public health people sent you an email about 3 months ago. That's why this is happening." Because no one knew those conversations were happening.
Yeah.
They weren't not only were not fully disclosed, they weren't acknowledged that they were going on in the first place. So I think that's part of what made people sort of worried about that. Um, but also the idea, specifically when it comes to the free expression question, is is whether there is a like you said rational basis, which is a term of art from the law. Whether is there a rational basis for saying that disinformation or misinformation is a credible construct in the first place, just logically.
Yeah.
So there's no objective definition of those things, although any particular case could be analyzed and litigated. There's no information bot that you can just feed something into and then get the answer like, oh, well, that's bing, that's true, or that's misinformation, right? These are all sort of
Yeah.
subjective arguments. So does it make sense, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, a red team, a blue team, to say, oh, well, we have our team has a new disinformation project and we're going to stamp out disinformation? Because doesn't that just mean political speech I don't like?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question. And for the most part, I would say no, they shouldn't have like a general disinformation, misinformation team that takes the form of like a fact checker, right? That's where things start to get really into trouble, especially when a lot of these companies use the same fact checkers. That's one of the things Chairman Carr and the FTC have been looking at is because a lot of these companies use the same fact checker, and therefore it was almost a uniform response to some of these things. But at the same time, you have to also understand that Russia, China, a lot of our foreign adversaries are doing disinformation campaigns, and if we're not having some kind of defense type response to that, we are doing ourselves a disservice. That doesn't necessarily, again, mean fact checking, right? That doesn't necessarily mean they work with the companies to take down the posts of these troll farms or whatever. But I just want to be very clear that we also do have a legitimate threat from foreign actors of using these services to cause dissent, to cause or to harms, and targeting those things isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just how do we go about doing it? Because again, I come from the school of thought that the best solution to bad speech is good speech, and obviously bad speech can drown out good speech in a lot of these social media companies, and that's why it's important to not have the finger on the scale because that allows the companies to respond in a way that best suits their users' need. They can moderate content, they can, protect users, they can create spaces where people can be heard. But, you know, again, when you start getting to that, like we have a disinformation team, this claim is false, and therefore you have to take it down by a government mandate. That's where you really start getting into a dangerous territory. And I mean, Commissioner Gomez actually at the open meeting at the FCC, excuse me, she's one of the Democrat commissioners on the FCC, said in her press conference, I believe yesterday, where it was like the biggest threat to free speech in this country isn't the private companies, it is government stepping into our lives. And that's very true. It's something I know you've been saying for a long time. I've been saying for a long time, and it feels like some of the Republicans are starting to equate the censorship, quote unquote, from the private companies and saying that's just as bad as government censorship. And it just quite frankly is not. And it's important to make sure that whatever the government does to prevent those foreign actors from interfering with the United States, that it doesn't go to the point where we're silencing speech now and we're limiting viewpoints because that's really what drove a lot of these concerns from conservatives in the first place. It was stories that either were, somewhat true or turned out to be completely true, that were taken off these platforms in response, and they were, I assume, done out of well intentions, but if you're still silencing speech, you're limiting the ability for the truth to get out there, and that's always going to be problematic.
Right. And so, we look at what's happening in other countries from the perspective of, like you said, like propaganda threats, like is the Chinese Communist Party trying to send a bunch of uh, uh, you know BS content our way via TikTok or whatever. Um, you know, Foreign actions can be propaganda threats, but look at it. I guess the question is, how do we look at the U.S. versus other countries more in terms of sort of like peer countries, countries that are sort of more like the United States, like, say Western Europe or the UK? How do our approaches to free speech and expression compare to some of our allies, right? Not
Yeah.
necessarily our adversaries, because we know they're not. We know they're terrible. The U.S., for all of our concerns, I think very legitimate concerns about protecting free expression from government overreach, we're still doing pretty well, right? Compared to
Yeah.
UK, compared to Germany, compared to a lot of places in the EU. And is that just because we have that First Amendment, or is it because of a wider kind of just like cultural belief that sort of backs up the First Amendment, or is it yet other stuff?
It's, another great question, and it's hard to say for sure. Obviously, the First Amendment's the most important part of this discussion. We have it. Germany, UK, they don't have that same belief, but I don't think it's just because it's in the law. I think it probably is a more deep cultural belief that we have in the United States. When we were kids, we grew up learning about the importance of free speech, learning about the importance of having a wide, you know, diversity of viewpoints. And you probably saw that. I believe it was 60 Minutes. Again, 60 Minutes comes up a lot in these discussions. Their story on speech police in Germany, and it's like, even if the German speech police, I'm probably using a not a great term there because that has its own connotations, but even if they're doing it from a well-intentioned desire to prevent Nazism from ever rising again in Germany, it's like, who knows what the next party is that's going to be in power, and what are they going to do with speech? What are they going to do to police speech? What are they going to do to promote different kinds of speech? Like, the things you impose now, because you have people that agree with you in power, can always be used against you in the future. And I think that's the real key about the First Amendment. It's that it doesn't really matter who's in office. Everyone's going to try to, stretch the bounds as much as they can. But as long as we have that backstop there, we're going to be able to have those dissenting viewpoints. We're going to be able to have ways of getting our communication out to other people. And I think it's just so critical, and it is rooted in our inherent, you know, beings, because this is just how you grow up in the United States, and it's something very cultural. It's something very important to us, and I just don't see those same beliefs, in Europe, and in China. It's very different, even more so than Europe, right? Like, where it's much more of like a collective. We're part of this bigger machine or whatever, but it's still that kind of like cog in the machine. Whereas we have that much more individual freedom approach here in the U.S. And I wouldn't trade it for any other approach in the world. And I think the important thing right now is just making sure our allies, even if they're not completely on board, are at least understanding of why we have this here, and they're not trying to silence speech on the internet writ large, because that is something that theoretically they could do. If you've got a company or a country pressuring Facebook to take down posts from folks in the UK, we might not see those posts in the US. They can have that kind of extraterritorial effect, and that is another concern. So we've really got to work together with our allies here, and push them towards those beliefs in free expression and free speech.
Yeah. So VPNs are your friend, and
Mhm. That is
that's good
always
for
true.
navigating around territorial restrictions.
Is this a NordVPN ad
It
spot real quick?
is. Not sponsored, but if
Not
any VPN
unsullied
companies,
from corporate sponsorship.
if anyone wants to hit us up, let me know. Um,
Richard Morrison's Nito stat of the night, unsullied by sponsorship.
so the this international question, I think, even when it comes to, like I said, people, countries that are our peer countries, countries that are our allies, or explicitly like our NATO allies, they can still be problematic when it comes to these sort of international agreements, when it comes to like the United Nations or some multilateral thing where everyone gets together and says, okay, well, we're all going to agree on this, the international global policy for whatever it is. So we have like, international environmental treaties, and we have agreements about things like, about free speech. But when it comes to this process and you get, whatever, 100 countries in one room, there's always the assumption that it's going to kind of everything's going to kind of even out, right? That like it's going to be the average of everyone else's policies. And that I think is very problematic. If the United States goes into any of these international agreements with the idea that our First Amendment protections are going to be watered down because they're going to be averaged against every other country's protections, then that's a problem, right? And
Yeah.
we've been very lucky because most internet innovation has happened in this country, right? And so the U.S. has had a sort of disproportionate, impact on it.
Well, I
But
wouldn't call that lucky. That
oh,
is very much a consequence of a lot of what we do here. But I agree with what you're saying.
but it's positive. So, uh, and with the rise of China, there's way more people who are online, who are people in People's Republic of China right now than there has ever been before, and so to that in that way, the balance of the internet is sort of tilting away from the U.S., right? Because in 1995, almost everyone who was online was an American, right?
Yeah.
And that's not true anymore. So I wonder, what do you see going forward as we have a world that is increasingly almost everyone is going to be online now, but a lot of those national governments of a lot of those people, including PRC, do not have the sort of free speech guarantees or privacy guarantees that we have.
Yeah. I think it's not so much it's necessarily going to affect how, and I apologize, my office light keeps shutting off. There we go. It's not so much that like we're not going to be able to still have kind of that open discussion in the US. I think we will. What I'm concerned about is almost, I don't want to say a bifurcation because it might, separate more than that, but well, we have like one global internet right now where you can connect to people across the world. I'm worried about, do some of these foreign countries, Russia, China, essentially block off access to their their own internet, and it probably wouldn't be as drastic as I'm making it out to be, but there is legitimately internet governance fights going on where the different models for how we allow people to communicate are being debated and they're being fought over. And obviously on the West, in the West, we've got our very open, very free dialogue, let traffic flow freely, but there's a lot of restrictions in some of these countries, and they can keep imposing more of those restrictions. And the more we separate groups off, the less perspectives we have. And, just as an example, one of my favorite podcasts right now, it's the Romance of the Three Kingdoms podcast. It's all about the ancient Chinese novel, the Three Kingdoms period of China, and I believe he's from China. It's a guy going through the novel. Do we lose stuff like that? Do we lose that kind of cultural interaction, which I think is very valuable in today's day and age, especially as tensions are rising, to be on a human level, be connecting with people? What do we lose if we lose some of those connections? That's the worry for me. I don't want to lose that podcast. I don't want to lose, people in China and Hong Kong losing access to Western media and Western individuals and cultures and stuff. So that's kind of where the concern starts to rise for me. I don't think we're really at that point yet, but like there's a lot to be said about countries trying to control communications, and they don't have the same beliefs in open dialogue like we do. So we could see attempts to restrict some of those interactions. And a lot of companies are not being allowed in China, for example, or vice versa, which may make total national security sense, but we're losing some of that already.
Yeah, I definitely do not want uh, young girls in China to lose access to Milan and all sorts of Western media. So coming back to the United States, well, actually, this could apply internationally as well, but thinking primarily about U.S. policy. So there's generally, like we said, because there's strong cultural support for free expression in general in the United States. There tends to be a lot of opposition when someone comes out with a policy that says, like, you know what, I'm here to shut down your ability to speak, right?
Yeah.
That's, um, but we also have plenty of policy proposals out there that are theoretically targeted at other goals, but would nevertheless interfere with free expression in some way and
Yeah.
have sort of first round issues. So, you know, how can we kind of distinguish between those conflicting goals? And one of them especially is protecting children online. So there's lots of proposals, both at the federal and the state level, that say, well, we got to protect kids from all sorts of things, whether it's, human trafficking or just age inappropriate content. Um, and so that's great, but some of the requirements, actually implementing some of the requirements that would be in some of this legislation would also get in the way of adults' free expression too, right? Because your your IP doesn't automatically know your age. A website doesn't automatically know your age, and the process of verification itself is a privacy violation
Yeah.
potentially. So, so how do you know when someone's good idea about policy X is actually problematic under Y being the free expression standard?
Yeah. I don't think you ever, I mean, from my perspective, you see the First Amendment concerns, the free speech concerns almost immediately every time kind of we look at a bill. But I think to your question is more of like as a lawmaker. Let's think in their shoes. When does my bill, raise these concerns? And I don't think there's like a clear cut answer. Obviously, for folks like me, the balance should always be on free expression. But I also understand that not everyone agrees with me on that. The kids' safety stuff is a great example where it's like if you have an age verification requirement, maybe. So it's like, well, we're not going to let children on Pornhub. So we're going to say you have to be 18 years or older to go onto Pornhub. If you write a law that just says Pornhub has to block it, now you're requiring individuals to give information to Pornhub, and that's going to prevent a lot of adults from going to that website. Sure, that's too much of a First Amendment violation. All right, now what if we have it do the App Store thing? That another proposal that's been coming out really recently has been like make the app stores age verify. Well, that's the same problem. Now you're just giving it to Apple or Google versus giving it to Pornhub, but you're still giving information. You can't, communicate anonymously online, which is one of the core beliefs of the First Amendment. But maybe we'll get to a point where you use a third party that has encrypted uh, communications with individual app stores, and the information they collect from you isn't very detailed. Maybe it's just a quick face scan that they don't store. Is on the net, is that still privacy protective enough to allow you to still be theoretically anonymous? Probably not. Maybe, but those are the kind of discussions that I hope the lawmakers are having. Because to answer your question, I don't know, but I know that as long as they're considering these questions, we're at least in a better place than we've been in the past, where sometimes it feels like it doesn't matter what the First Amendment concerns are. Protecting the kids would just trump all of those, and it can get frustrating as somebody who's trying to protect those First Amendment rights, the free expression rights, that when we're trying to say there's a concern and you just get accused of not caring about children. It's like, no, there's just a balance here. And right now the bills are going too far in the balance of silencing speech, but that doesn't necessarily mean they will never find that right balance. And um, it's a hard question to answer, but the technology as it improves, maybe we'll be able to get to a point where um, there's some, technological fixes that can kind of give us the best of both worlds. I haven't seen anything convincing yet, but who knows?
Well, yeah, the you know the response always that to a bad piece of legislation is like, oh well, you don't care about the problem then. It's like, no, I care about the problem. I just think we're going to give up some of our rights to solve a problem and then not solve it.
Yeah, and that's the other part of this. A lot of these proposals wouldn't actually do much to protect children online, and um, sometimes it's just throw a lot of liability on the companies and assume they'll figure it out. And I don't know why we think they will. You know what I mean? Like
Well,
it's not the best track record.
well, yeah. So on the topic of technology potentially theoretically being able to sort of solve its own problems, or sort of, evolve past this. I think the sort of tech policy world, in terms of, digital computing technology and telecommunications, um, is one of the few places where sometimes, we have policy people come and say like, look, the market's gonna just we're gonna outrun this problem, right? We're gonna have new technology, all the old stuff, no one worries about fax machine regulation anymore, right? We're not still debating fax machine regulation to the extent that there ever was any, right? And that there are at least use cases where we can imagine today's, angry debates about stuff becoming obsolete, right? Because stuff we'll move past it. And so to circle back to where we started, which is the idea of broadcast license and the FCC being able to like regulate what's said or not said online or on broadcast specifically, because we have this legacy engineering problem, like you said. Too many broadcast signals in the same area would make them unusable. Therefore, there has to be limitations. Therefore, the government is in charge of deciding who gets a license and who doesn't. When the person who was interviewing Chairman Carr at this event for Semaphore that uh, this week said, uh, asked him about this, whether broadcasters should actually have to follow this sort of public interest standard. And he said, Carr said, if you're a broadcaster and you don't want to serve the public interest, you're free to turn your license in. You can go podcast. You can go over the top, end quote. So obviously, I'm deeply in favor of everyone podcasting. Um, but the this does introduce this question that if the FCC is only has this like really specific power to regulate broadcasters, then the solution is obvious. Just don't be a broadcaster, right?
Yeah.
Be a streaming platform, be a podcaster, be whatever you want. Be digital, be streaming, be online, and not over the airwaves. You're a dinosaur if you want to go into broadcasting in the first place. Is this perspective? That obviously doesn't help companies that have been around for 100 years, whose business is broadcasting.
Yeah.
But for other people who are not already heavily invested in that world, is that the solution? Just don't be a broadcaster.
Yeah, I don't think that's the solution, right? Because I think there's a couple factors at play here. Number one, yes, you could go to a different service and or a different way to reach consumers, and of course that's always an option. Commissioner or chairman, I got to get used to calling him chairman. Chairman Carr is definitely right about that. But I think at the end of the day, like if you are telling the broadcaster just stop reaching consumers who have the antenna, you're leaving that gap in coverage. And I would much rather say instead of regulating everybody up to broadcasters, regulate broadcasters down to everybody else. So that way they can compete and see if the technology is actually something consumers would prefer over a podcast and allow them to compete on the merits. And, if they do not want to deal with these broadcaster regulations, yes, just go over the top and that's always an option. And I actually think it's a viable option, but I also don't want to ruin broadcasting and say, let's artificially hold this technology back because it's struggling enough as it is, in my opinion. I don't think that many people still tune into broadcast. Even the people who do tune into the local broadcast tend to do it over cable, but maybe that's changing again. I've got an antenna now because I don't want to pay for cable television, and I still want to get my local broadcasting. So I just have an antenna now that plugs in. But I think the other kind of component to this, and it's something where I want to push back on the chairman a little bit, is that sure, you could just go into podcasting. I haven't seen much from this administration that makes me think they're going to stop at broadcasting. You know what I mean? Like they're very willing to find different avenues to regulate any kind of speech that they don't like. And obviously, the Section 230 is a big part of it. Theoretically, if you're a podcaster, you don't have user generated content, it wouldn't necessarily come into play as much. But what about like a privacy rule, or what about some of these restrictions on retransmission, or maybe they're putting pressure on the ISPs to not host your content if you're giving bad coverage to the president. Like site blocking legislation is coming back for legitimate reasons. There's a lot of piracy online, but you get accidentally wrapped up into something like that. It's not within the FCC's jurisdiction to go after like a podcast, but I wouldn't be surprised to see this administration try to pressure folks that are disagreeing with them. So I don't think it's the most viable solution in the world, but at the same time, he is right. you can go to other mediums and they aren't regulated the same as broadcasters. And I think consumers are more and more getting their content from these other mediums. And honestly, to me, rather than say, okay, that's just how you go about it and we keep broadcasting it as it is, to me, that means broadcasters are facing all this competition. Let's let them compete. Let's let them not have to have these same rules and regulations that nobody else has. And because they have these licenses, and instead just like let them go on the market and say, you know what, maybe we're going to air Game of Thrones on Fox, at 7 o'clock because that's what the viewers want, rather than saying, well, we can't do that because there's nudity or violence or whatever other restriction that prevents, Game of Thrones. And maybe the consumers don't want that. Maybe that's very likely that the families wouldn't want that on their channels anyway. But to me, it just seems like the better approach is to say this technology has some unique aspects. Go compete on the merits, rather than just saying, well, if you don't like it, get out of the business.
Well, yeah, and the sort of regulatory arbitrage between old technology and new technology is interesting. So if you look at, say, like taxi services and Uber, right? So taxi services in practically every city, usually they're more sort of city regulated than like statewide regulated, like other industries would be, because there's not a lot of taxi service in rural areas. But if you looked at the pre-Uber world of taxis in big cities, um, they were almost all very tightly regulated. They all had their own
Yeah.
separate commissions. They had rules not just that applied to them, but applied only to them, and that were often also, in classic case of regulation, written by incumbents to favor themselves and things like that. But then Uber came along and said, "Oh, well, we're a software company. We're not a transportation company. We're gonna do our own thing. None of these old rules apply to us, or that is at least our legal position." And so there were a bunch of fights, of course, and a lot of cities didn't like that. But when it when it was clear that Uber had like reached takeoff velocity, right, that they weren't just gonna get shut down and they were here to stay. A lot of the taxi cab people, livery cars, limo drivers, all those people who had been living for decades under these existing rules that they had kind of learned to live with, they said, well, this is not fair because Uber doesn't have to follow the same rules we do. They should have to follow more rules. Like they should have to pay more costs. We should burden them
Mhm.
more so that it brings us up to equality. And the response from Uber and plenty of free market people and plenty of other people said, like, no, no, no. If there's a if there's a inequality, we should deregulate the side with more rules, not
Yeah.
add on a bunch of additional rules to like the new innovative entrants to, so we should, to the extent that we need equality in that sense, it should be in the side of liberalization, not in the side of ever more regulation.
Yeah.
And it seems like to some extent, in an uneven, maybe ultimately unsatisfying way, that we kind of have gone more in that direction, right? We haven't just said, oh, Uber and Lyft now have to pay, um, you know, 200% of their normal rate to keep the taxi cab people in business.
Yeah, no, I mean that is definitely true, and I think it is a very much a parallel for the broadcasting space. But I would even argue it makes even less sense in the broadcasting space because a lot of those regulations, theoretically, they're not all this way, but a lot of them are designed for like safety or like traffic congestion or something to that effect. Whereas we're dealing with speech, on the other hand, and there is a very limited reason for why you would regulate a broadcaster that just is not applicable to something like a podcast or, an internet site or a newspaper even. And it there's no First Amendment justification in my mind to impose additional regulations on these other technologies. So the only real solution to me is to just lower those barriers to broadcast. Because if you just keep the current rules as they are and you keep it's not just content stuff. There's a lot of ownership restrictions. There's a lot of rules about like filings that just add, administrative costs that again, their competitors don't have to pay. If you keep all these in place and consumers continue to move over the internet, over IP based offerings, the industry could die out. And my argument is that there is still good use cases for broadcast, especially, a lot of them are good ways of getting alerts out. There's, free television, which is always great for, low income families. A lot of the time broadcasters, because of the nature it's over the air, it's going to be limited in range. So it's inherently more local. There's a lot of positives. And I think if we can deregulate the broadcasters and allow them to air truly what those consumers want, it provides a competitive alternative to some of these sites where a lot of people have concerns about, right? Like, if you're a parent, you don't like what your kids are seeing on the internet, and you've got a local broadcaster that is airing maybe a kid's show at a certain time. Well, it's like, oh, I can rely on this because this is much more suited to my needs. So it just seems to me that like it's better for the consumer, it's better for the market, and it's just better for speech if we just deregulate the broadcasters and not really try to pressure them into doing things that they don't necessarily want to do, and beyond that, just impose a lot of financial costs that their competitors, because again, like broadcasters' competitors isn't other broadcasters, and it's not even cable anymore. It's Twitter, it's sorry, X, it's Instagram, it's YouTube. It's when I'm watching TV, a lot of time I'll just put a YouTube video on, and it'll be like an hour-long video about Sopranos episode where they drops Meadow off at college, right? Like a whole breakdown of what Tony's going through. Like that is content, and that's what they're competing with. So it's important to kind of make sure we create a space where they can compete on the merits because that's who they're competing with.
Right. So in terms of, you know, creating space where people actually can compete, uh, put on your Harry Potter hat for a second and
Never read the
say,
books.
all right, if you've
I did read.
got,
I did watch the movies though. So
but if you've got a magic wand and you
okay.
are you're able to like change some of the regulations or even the laws about how this is governed right now, because we talked about how a lot of these issues that we're talking about are based on laws and regulations that are decades old, and so we kind of have to work within them right now. Imagine you don't have to work within them, and the Jeff Westling Communications Reform Act of 2025 is about to be passed. What is going to be in that imaginary magic bill that is going to make this whole situation for broadcast media better?
Okay, so I think there's two things. First is what's in that bill, and then second, before we even get to that bill, the Jeff Westling is somehow on the Supreme Court, and he overturns Red Lion. It says basically the height the medium scrutiny that broadcasters get because of the what that we discussed earlier. They've got limited numbers, so therefore the First Amendment justifications aren't as strong. You don't have to go to the strict scrutiny standard for a legal term. Um, I'd get rid of that to start with, and uphold the same kind of First Amendment standards that you do for newspapers, that you do for cable, for whatever other service. So that would be the first thing. But then what's in the actual rules? A lot of it would be just getting rid of what's on the books now. There's a lot of, like I said, media ownership requirements, basically limiting like conglomerates being able to buy a bunch of broadcasters in different markets, right? I'd get rid of those kind of rules because there's a lot of efficiencies that are gained when you can, have an overarching network, but they work with a bunch of local affiliates. So they'll have maybe 2 hours of the nationwide programming. They'll have some nationwide commercials, but they'll also have those station specific local commercials, local shows that go along with it. And there's just restrictions in place right now that prevent, a lot of this kind of these efficiencies from being realized. I'd probably get rid of some of the kid TV rules. If there's a market for it, they can show it. If not, a lot of these kids are watching like Bluey or I'm sorry, I don't know much about what kids are watching these days. I don't have any children. But Miss Rachel, I think, is one that my niece watches a lot. You can find those online, I assume, or maybe it's like on a Disney app. There's different ways to get those things. So I would say, look, we don't need to have these over the broadcasting over the air anymore. I definitely get rid of the news distortion rule. That one to me is just rife for problems, and it's something that one in particular is frustrating because I was arguing last administration to get rid of that, saying like it will be weaponized against you, Democrats. This is a good time to get rid of it, and nobody wanted to get rid of it, and now it's theoretically, being weaponized against them. Um, but so a lot of these kind of rules are would be what I'm going after if I had my choice. But again, I think it has to start first with going back to the courts and saying, look, broadcasters have just the same First Amendment rights as any other kind of medium. Theoretically, you could lose your license, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to have like a news distortion rule. There's inherently going to be some uh, regulation on broadcasters that's going to exist that doesn't exist in other markets, but it should be minimal.
All right. Well, Jeff, this has been an excellent conversation, and these are very insightful comments of yours. And hopefully, both the commissioners of the FCC, the justices of the Supreme Court, and members of Congress will heed your suggestions. And in the meantime, though, remind everyone where they can go to find all of your valuable work online.
Well, it's the AmericanActionForum.org. You can find me under the text section, or you can just follow me at Jeffrey Westling on Twitter. That's where I tweet most of my work, but also a lot of random things about basketball, One Piece, and just random things that are crossing my mind. So that's generally where you can find me.
Yes, definitely follow Jeff for all the tech policy and sports tweets you could possibly want.
And follow
Uh,
Richard for the AI generated photos that have been now my banner photo, I think, is one of your creations on Twitter. The cat reading a book, I think, was one
yes,
of yours.
there's a lot of great AI generated images out there. We'll follow us both for that as well. All right, Jeff. Thanks very much for being with us.
No, thanks for having me.